Hello, this is the third episode in the JavaScript Bushido series, where I teach Cookstoo programming. Previously I went to the installation of Cookstoo and how to build your first application with it. In this episode I want to build an application which can communicate to a backend server using the RESTful API. As usual, I will provide links to the source code and an online play area below this video. But before we get to the coding part, I want to give a brief history of the involved technologies. The normal HTTP-based request-response paradigm shifted in 2005 when AJAX, also known as XML HTTP request, became popular through the utilization in Google Maps. Before AJAX, every call to the backend server would usually refresh the whole web page, unless you would do some iframe-based trickery. Additionally, in 2011, WebSockets and WebRTC have been added to most browsers, which allow an efficient way to communicate between server and browser, as well as browser to browser. Using either method, it is possible to load data or code dynamically into the web page. Now, what is REST? REST stands for Representational State Transfer. Roy Fielding defined REST in his PhD dissertation from 2000 titled Architectural Styles and the Design of Network-Based Software Architectures at the University of Irvine. Unlike SOAP-based web services, there is no official standard for RESTful web APIs. This is because REST is an architectural style, while SOAP is a protocol. A RESTful API usually provides a means to do CRUD operations on an object. What is CRUD? CRUD is an acronym and stands for Create, Read, Update and Delete. It is a way to say, I want to be able to create, read, update or delete something somewhere, compressed into a single word. Before there was REST, there was JSON RPC. REST has become the de facto standard in modern web-based applications. It has replaced the XML-based SOAP WSDL for Web Services Definition Language, as well as JSON RPC in most cases. So for you geeks out there, you can free up that part of your brain and fill it with newer and cooler data, like this tutorial. Now let's get back to Cookstoo and how it all fits together. First, I want to show you how you can load additional code from the server into the browser. Well, the first thing we have to do, let's open the IDE. Let me move it out of the way here and make it a bit bigger. Then we gotta create a new class. In this case, we take the standard window class and we call it RESTful app.js and save that. So we created this, and the next thing we want to do is to actually I have a piece of code here that allows me to load additional code from the backend, which is called require. Now if you look at the code, you can see that it actually under the hood it's using the Cookstoo qx.bomb.requestScript class to do the work, but it's calling it in a way that once all the files are loaded, it's going to return with the callback function. Now the next thing we need to do is save this. Next thing we need to do is we need to create another empty file or a JavaScript file because we want to load something and execute it. So let's call it file1.js. Save this. We can delete the template class and simply create a new function. Let's call it hello1. And let's return a string hello from file1, and let's do the same thing function, and let's do the same thing again. Let's create a new class, a plain JavaScript class, create new, and let's call this file2.js, and here we go. Let's delete this. Bang! And call it function hello2, and we return a different string. In this case we say writing from file2, and we save this as well. So now, how do we utilize this require? And this requires is heavily based off the require.js that is well known in JavaScript. Now, the way that we leverage this is by simply calling it. So this is attached to the document, right? So after we created this window, we call it document.require. And we pass it an array of the files that we want to load. In this case, file 1.json and file 2.json, and then followed by the followed by the function call. In this case, the function does not have any parameter, and this. So, and here, what we do is we just set the value of a label that we have to create. This next set value, and then we call the function hello1. And the other thing is, after a while, I want to create a timer that when it expires, it overrides that text. So qx.event.timer.once, which is a static function in that timer class. And then here we call it function. We implement the lambda function for this, and then we say again this.txt.setValue. In this case, I want to override it with a function from file 2, hello, basically hello2, and then I need to pass in this object, close this, and then we're done. So let's save this. Before we move on, we gotta do some modifications down here. I want to leave that label, and we can move it up. So let's move it up to 10. Let's move it up to the left and 10 as well. And I want to create another label that is doing the same thing, and it's basically just a placeholder where we can set first image and text, and then we set the top to 50 so that it's a little bit below, and then the last thing we have to do is this text equals label. And then let's see what happens if we execute the program. So here we have hello world, hello from file 1, and then I forgot one thing that I have to do here. It's a typo. And I need to provide the amount of time that we want to wait, the delay. So let's save this again, start it, hello from file 1, and overriding from file 2. Now let's take a look at how we can load some data using a RESTful API. For that, I'm using an open API which is freely available, so that I don't have to worry about the authentication for now. And the data that we're looking at will look about like this. Let me copy it over. So we have an album ID, an ID, title, the URL, and a thumbnail URL, and then that whole thing is a JSON array. So now I want to display the images from the server on the left side of the window, and I want to display more information on the right side of the window when I click on the list control. So as the next step in this application, we want to add the widgets which are required to handle the functionality for the RESTful API. We need one list control where we display all requested data, and we also need a container where we display some details of a certain photo. So let's go down here and just in between the steps. So next we want to add a list control to display the array of items we will get from the RESTful API. and we want to set the width of the list to 230. To give it some space, and we want to add it to this document. And we want to set the location of the list to 80 from the top. We want to set it to 50 from the bottom, and we want to set it to the left, 10 to the left. So now with this out of the way, the next thing that we want to add is the container where we display more detailed information when we click on the list control itself. For this, I want to simply copy the code snippet over here so it does not take up too much time. And what we create is basically a composite container which has a layout of a virtual VBox layout, which is basically adding new items below the previously existing items. So I don't have to worry about the layout structure. And we set the background color to see the list control, otherwise it would be invisible for if it does not have any items in it. We want to retain it, and then we add it to the main widget again. And let's save this and see what happens if we start it up. So here we have the list control, and here we have the space for the details view. So next we need to figure out how do we get the data actually into the list control. And for this we need to create a controller which takes care of converting the JSON that we retrieve from the RESTful API into the proper format and display it into the widget, inside the widgets. So we create the controller here, and this controller is a QXData controller list, which is specific to the list control. We don't have currently any data, so we pass null, and we want to connect it to this list control up here. We also want to set the path to the label, which is title in this case, and the path to the icon, which is a thumbnail URL. So if you look at the data that we do expect to see back, this is the title, so this will be displayed. And this is the thumbnail URL, so we can display a little icon on the left side of the list control. So and now finally we get to the very interesting part of the tutorial, where we actually go ahead and we interact with RESTful API. For this I chose a API which is freely available, which you can find here. And then we go ahead and we actually create the Cookstoo object for this API, which is qxio rest.resource. And we define the method that we want to use, or the function in this case. And this is defined through the method get, or the verb get in REST parlance. And we get the information from this endpoint, which is root, plus photos. And this will return then a full list of items that we can display in the list control. But in order for anything to happen, we also need to register a callback to handle the information. So once we call this function, this callback function is being called, and we can simply implement this function here. So here we implement the photos get function. And what we receive back from that callback is a event, and this event contains data. So let's extract the data, data, and let's make this a bit smaller. So in order for this to be displayed inside the list control, we actually have to create a model. So let's create a model from that data. Data.marshall.json create model, and we pass the simple JavaScript array that we retrieve from the RESTful API call. And the final step in this saga is to actually connect the controller with the model. So let's do this controller set model, and then we can go and try it out. Get data, save it, and click the button, so let's see what happens. And here we retrieve the information. This is the information that we retrieved from the RESTful API, and we display it inside the list control. And so now finally let's take a look at how we are actually going to be able to pass an attribute through the RESTful API. In order to do this, let's add another API endpoint that we want to take care of here, up here. So we do this. And in this case, what we do is, instead of getting a list, we're requesting a single ID, a single photo from the API. And let's call this photo this data member photo instead of photos, and let's call the functions photo get instead of photos get, and let's implement this here. So we get photos get. So now what we do get back from the RESTful API in this case is not an array or a list, it's actually an object. So we do get the object. We don't need these 3 lines. And then what we want to do with this object, we want to actually display this in the list control. So in order to do this, we simply extract the information from the object. So this object has an album ID, title, URL, and you can see, we can take a look at the JSON that we return back. We want to display that information here. Then we can create a label that we simply add to the main widget of our interface. So one last thing that we need to do is we need to kick off the action. We need to start the action, and that is done by adding another callback listener to the list control. So let's do this here. So in this callback, we get the array. Basically, from when you click on it, we get an array of selected items, and we know that we want to have a single select, so it's the index 0. So we get the first item of the selection when the selection changes, and we retrieve the model, the URL, and the ID from the object that we now have, and then we call on this new API photo.get. And we pass it the ID and the actual ID, and that is this variable. And this ID here is actually what is displayed, what is set up here in this field. So if I would call this IDX, it would be IDX. So let's save this. Let's click start. Let's retrieve the list, and let's click. And you can see we have received a call through the RESTful API, another call through the RESTful API, and we're expanding the size here. Well, this concludes the 3rd episode in the JavaScript Bushido series. Thank you so much for watching this video. You can find a link to the source code below. You can also leave me a comment here or visit my blog under softwaresamurai.org, where you will find more information about JavaScript, Cookstoo, or programming in general. Also, please let me know if there's a certain topic or problem you want me to talk about in a future episode. I'm always open for suggestions. I hope to see you back soon.